this presentation, as already outlined, was part of, well, this is kind of built upon my master's dissertation, that I was exploring this as I was preparing for ordination. I was exploring kind of the interplay between the stuff that I was learning about theology and spirituality and being a vicar, combined with some of the experiences that I'd had working with those living with dementia, those who maybe were connecting with their faith and their spirituality in a way that was different than perhaps what we might describe as the standard way of engaging with church or faith. And this kind of dissertation and then this kind of presentation kind of sprang out from that research and offers both an exploration of spirituality and dementia, as well as a couple of sort of suggestions to things that we could do. But it's not meant to be an exhaustive list. It's supposed to be kind of a starter to kind of get you thinking about ways of engaging. As we know, dementia-related memory loss is getting increasingly common. When I was preparing this presentation, it was 1 in 14 who were 65 and above, but I believe that number has now increased. So it's sort of more like 1 in 10 to 12 rather than 1 in 14 have a diagnosis of some form of dementia. And all of you here have done work, I know, with Sarah, and are doing things to do with dementia-friendly church, are engaging with those who are living with dementia. And the majority of engagement of the church, of Christian-related organisations to those living with dementia, is to seek to offer dignity, to offer meaningful activity, games or clubs, or to provide places of support where those that are living with dementia and their carers can meet and support one another. It's often about sort of looking at the image of God that is innate in all humankind, that still exists within the individual, but there is a sense of kind of holding out for that end time when all things will be redeemed and restored. The caregiver or the family members or those working with those living with dementia, we take great hope in this concept of restoration, of redemption, of the one that they love, even when it feels like the one in front of them seems lost. Now, this is fantastic work, and I am in no way knocking the work of Dementia Friendly Church, and have been very active and involved in where I am at the moment, working with our dementia coordinator with Dementia Friendly Church. But Isaiah 58, verse 10, explores the promises for those who by faith keep the fast that God has chosen. And at the end, if people keep their faith, their night will be like the noonday. Augustine, the great spiritual thinker, he described what we know of ourselves by God's light. And he said this, he said, if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, this is Isaiah, the darkness will rise in the darkness and your night will be like the noonday. And Augustine used this to describe of what we know about ourselves, that it's known by God's light. And what we do not know, we won't know until the darkness becomes like the noonday before your face. It is that keeping on with the faith until that last moment. But I wanted to ask, as I was exploring my research and as I was thinking about my own experiences with those living with dementia, what about before then? What about before the night is the noonday? What about the individual spiritual life of those living with dementia now? The individual spiritual life of those living with dementia needed to be considered alongside the need for interaction, support, and dignity. And so then I asked myself the question, what could this spiritual life look like? How could we, as faithful Christians in Christian communities, nurture, foster, and connect with this spirituality? And as we begin to explore this, I just want to give two very kind of brief, not particularly comprehensive definitions of what I mean here. Firstly, spirituality, I'm speaking about an individual's journey of faith, their own faith practices, their relationship with God, with other Christians, and their experiences of God or faith, and that overall quest for purpose. Then, of course, dementia, we know, is an umbrella term for that set of diseases that is mostly progressive in nature, that affects the memory, cognitive ability, behavior, that affects the ability for an individual to maintain the activities of daily living. Lots of the usual activities, however, in the realm of spirituality link to memory. There's a gentleman called Peter Atkins, and he wrote about memory and liturgy. He wrote of the recall of particular words and actions and events that we do through the liturgy of the church. And he, for example, remembered that we remember the Last Supper in communion. It's an act of memory that we're doing. And he said this: above all, activities and worship is providing the opportunity to remember God, to recall the relationship between us and him, and to recapture the sense of belonging and value that restores us to harmony and humility that are the hallmark of true humanity. Worship, says Atkins, through memory links us to the past. It affirms us in the present and causes us to reflect on the way heard in the company of the divine spirit. To remember God brings us to our true place and potential in the created order and enables us to be in harmony, full shalom, peace with God and all things. Through the use of the liturgy, the rhythm of the words, it moves individuals from a place where they feel that they are on by themselves to a place where they feel that they are able to connect with God. Perhaps you've been to a service that has felt unfamiliar, either in liturgical shape or in a form that you found harder to connect with. You can't quite feel the worship. And so liturgy is one of those things that if you are used to it, if it's something that you have known all your life, will be a great connection point, and for others will not be. But I found over time that there was such a wealth of resource in connecting with people who were living with dementia spirituality by talking about liturgy, by using things like the prayer of preparation, Almighty God, to whom all hearts are open, something that they were used to praying in and out week after week. William Barclay also wrote of an encounter with God that is found in communion, and he directly links the individual's act of remembering with the encounter with God found in the elements of communion. We remember Jesus Christ in the sacrament in order to encounter Jesus Christ, he said. And through memory, the experience then is turned to an encounter. It's a connection point for spirituality. Many of us know, of course, that music and memory also have such strong links. There's a structure and a pattern to music that we store and we recall. We identify and categorize music as organ music or pop music, or, oh, that's the tune to Happy Birthday. This recall probably also determines our musical preference or style. But music, as we know, has been shown to be a real key area of connection for those living with dementia. And it's clear that an individual's spiritual life is shaped and formed by the music they sing and remember. I particularly remember, as an activity coordinator, sitting down with an individual who used to be in a church choir. And whilst he couldn't remember my name or perhaps even what he'd done that morning, he could sing line for line, word for word, the entirety of a huge number of hymns. Prayers often involve some kind of recall. Confessionary prayer requires a remembering, not least the concept of remembering what sin is, but also those that an individual might have committed. Prayers of thanksgiving could be argued to require a recalling of things that we should be thankful for. Intercessory prayer would require an active remembering others or their situations in prayer. But I wonder if a type of prayer that is more contemplative, about being in the moment, about quietening or emptying the mind of other thoughts and focusing on a single concept or word that allows a stilling of thoughts and emotions, it allows a disassociation of memory. And it may be that this can be a point to encounter God in a kind of thought space that is created in that moment. For those living with dementia, thoughts and emotions at times can be muted. Thus, it could be easier for some of these individuals to be able to move into a quieter and more contemplative space. When the church that I was involved with used to come into the care home to offer communion, It was in those moments where the individuals had received communion themselves and were asked to pause and be still, that many of them came to a stillness that was not evident the rest of the time that they were there. There was a quietening of the entirety of their body and their mind in that place of worship. Problem is, though, of course, if memory and spirituality are so interlinked, how are we going to engage with this if we are also working with the spirituality of an individual whose capacity for memory is diminished? Now, to explore this further, I'm going to look at children's spirituality, and this is not to say that we infantilize the individual living with dementia, but actually it's to come back and look at how spirituality is developed in a child to begin with. Some things that we all have as adults, some encounters, some experiences, some feelings that we all know, but perhaps as an adult we choose to rationalize or to mute. So God has never required our understanding, and certainly not our education or our intellect, our rationality or composure, in order to commune with us. And in fact, children, as a young child grows in a place where there's love and acceptance, it leads to a trust and an understanding of the rudiments of faith, the safety and trust of the world around them, and then consequently the divine, unfortunately in some cases a distrust. There's a kind of relationality there that is based on touch and softly spoken words. And this is still present in those living with dementia. I mean, I'd say it's still present in all of us. The image of God value that is placed upon each individual from child to adult is so important. And it requires no cognition, it requires no memory, and it requires nothing but the love of God to be able to encounter this. God communes with us, and it doesn't matter how clever we are or how rational we can be, he still talks to us and engages us. And we see this in children. So why do we ignore it when this sense of just being in the presence of God is there and evident with us as adults? And in fact, it's something that many people try and go and practice, particularly with the modern movement of mindfulness or Christian meditation. A sense of wonder is always prevalent in children. There's a sense of wonder at the world, a sense of wonder at other people, a sense of relationship and of love that is innately felt by a child, and I believe and strongly believe can be felt by everyone, those living with dementia and all of us. The sense of wonder at what happens when you turn on the tap. How does the water come out? How does the striking of a match lead to a flame? Or how do the colours of the sunset do that? Aren't really questions that the child asks. Instead, they wonder at it. They look at it. They engage with it. They connect with it on an emotional level rather than a cognitive level. And this sense of wonder is perhaps a sense that can be connected to by those living with dementia. This sense of wonder and of connection is a connection to something other than themselves, the kind of mystery of the everyday. It's not reliant on knowledge or memory. This wondering at the everyday could easily turn to spiritual, meaningful spiritual interaction for those living with dementia, that wonder at something beyond themselves. Perhaps taking some time to wonder with an individual, asking them how they feel about certain things, or asking them what they think or feel about what they're seeing, rather than an explanation of, well, of course, the water's coming out of a pipe that's pumped into our homes. Instead, let's just wonder at the feel of water as we touch it. Let's just wonder at the brightness and the flickering of the flame. Let's just wonder at the colours of the sunset. And this wonder can move to an expression of wonder of faith through simple conversations, such as asking an open question like, what comes to mind when you think of God? Or where might we find Jesus today? And I think building on this sense of wonder, the use of church buildings is a wonderful connection point. For I walk into church buildings. This is the church building where I am currently curate. And as I walk in, there's always a sense of the building. You walk through a porchway into this vast open space with an intricate font, with a long aisle with different textures and different carved wood, with a colourful cloth at the front that matches the colour that's on the pulpit, that is different from the colour that's down in the side chapel. And then there's the organ, the music. There's a sense of connection, a sense of wonder that can be had in a church building without having to rush through or to sit through a service, just being in that space and looking at the wonderful things that we see around us. Buildings, of course, particularly church buildings, if it's the church building that that individual is used to going in, will already form connection points. It will be a moment of reminiscence for them. I'll never forget one of the times I took a lady into the church that she had grown up in, and as she walked in, she could suddenly remember all the people's names that she was there with. She could remember the vicar's names that she'd seen while she'd been there. She could remember being part of the serving team. She could remember helping to arrange the flowers for a special event. It was a real connection point just by walking into that building. As well as that, there is always creative activities using the expression of our creativity to connect with our spirituality. There are those that will do this more naturally than others, of course, but creativity is relying on a different form of processing than that of memory. The spirituality of an individual, when asked to paint or create how they feel about themselves or about God, can be a real point to interact with an individual's spirituality. And then to discuss this, to share this with one another, to create that relational encounter with God together. And similarly, of course, contemplating nature can always be a point to connect with God. We can talk about the beauty of nature, I'm sure, for as long as you like. But this in front of us now is a picture that one of my children drew for me. And this, I think, gives us a glimpse into something sacred in children's spirituality. Now, this picture, when you look at it on its base level, is just some colouring lines on a piece of paper. But actually, it was something that the child had created, had decided was important, and had decided to gift to me. And therefore, as such, there is a great value in the transfer of that, in the relationship that is built there. And so the use of the creative arts is such an incredible connection point to be able to connect with God, with others, because there's such value that can be placed on the simplest of things, even if it doesn't look like very much. It's about slowing down sometimes, stopping and pausing, asking and speaking about what this is or what this means. This picture in particular, I was informed, was a picture of a field, and I can't quite see that. But my child, when they were telling me about it, was adamant that this was a beautiful field. And I could have gone, no, this is just scratches on paper. But instead, I said, no, okay, well, tell me what this bit is and what's this bit about? And there was a real conversation and a real connection point for my child and me in that instant that I think if we would just be like, oh, they've just made marks on paper, we overlooked. I mean, at the end of the day, abstract art sometimes looks a bit like this. So, and they can sell for thousands and thousands of pounds. It's about the value that we choose to place on things. It's about that connection that we choose to make as opposed to dismissing. There's also that moment where that free use of imagination, there can be that glimpse, as I say, into spirituality. And Rebecca Nye says that this is, speaking of children's spirituality, that the creativity that the child has can show us something of what they think about the world. It can give us a glimpse into something sacred that we mustn't ignore. And as God is experienced in childhood through what is sensed or imagined, it's therefore really important to consider the sensual spirituality of dementia. A way of engaging with this could be through art, could be through story, could be through going for a walk, could be through holding an acorn in the palm of your hand, could be through feeling a leaf could be through watching the birds, because the senses are the only requirement, not a coherent understanding of reality. The picture might not make a lot of sense, but they're meaningful to the child, and through talking to them, it becomes meaningful to me. Being present in the moment is another point where we can forge a connection point with those living with dementia. And John Swinton writes a lot about dementia. Many of you have probably come across him. These are two of his books that I recommend. But in Becoming Friends of Time, he speaks of slowing down and listening to an individual speaking, letting them hear, letting them tell their story and listening to their story. And we already know that reminiscence can be a powerful connection point for those living with dementia. Through reminiscence, through the recall of past events and earlier memories, I think and believe that it is possible to connect to a point where an individual living with dementia felt closer to God. And I think if this knowledge of an encounter with God in a past time is brought and recalled and lifted to the surface, it may then be possible to connect with an individual's spirituality in the present. And this is something that we teach in churches all the time. The amount of times when you have a sermon and someone says, think of a moment when did you feel connected to God? Or have you ever felt like this? And in fact, if you look through scripture, there are many instances in the New Testament where Jesus calls his listeners to think back to the great stories that they would have known of Israel, of the Old Testament, to recall those moments of connection with the people and with God. Swinton calls it a sacrament of time, where you slow down and pay attention to individuals. And in doing so, you can encounter one another fully, and in doing so, encounter God. It communicates a much deeper form of commitment to the other, a deeper paying attention that begins to notice all that makes an individual unique and different. And in doing so, there is, I believe, a glimpse into how God may see us in the present moment. And of course, we should never discount a spiritual encounter for an individual in a moment, even if they can't remember it the next. There's not enough time to explore all these kind of concepts in great detail. There are far more connection points to individual spirituality than the cognitive demands that we often place on spirituality. And I've offered a few suggestions. And I've offered some that hasn't necessarily given us a full coherent picture of spirituality, but are at sort of springing off points as we begin to engage with the spirituality of those living with dementia, which ultimately will be just as unique as the individual living with dementia. But it falls to us at times, as we interact with those as we interact with those who can't remember, to be the ones who remember in our interactions with those living with dementia, that there is always a person before us. It's not just someone who, when they die, will be sorted out because God will remember them, who holds some sort of cast image of a person who once was, but there is a living and breathing person on earth now. So how do we encourage faith in that individual? How do we help them to experience God? And I've not got the answer. As I say, I just offered some potential routes that we might want to explore. And I have seen on many occasions those living with dementia have real, significant, meaningful experiences through these simple expressions of music, of wonder, liturgy, relationality, through reminiscence, through slowing down to listen, to speak to those individuals. I mean, yeah, I might have done it in a secular setting as an activity coordinator, but even then, there were opportunities for spiritual reflection. I'm sure that these same routes can lead to deep expressions of spirituality, can lead to a growing faith in that individual, not just a holding out for the end. And ultimately, for those living with dementia, they will be redeemed, as all those who seek to be Christ-like shall be. But it's really important to continue to engage with an individual living with dementia's spirituality. Their spirituality should be encouraged and nourished. Their relationship with God should not be given a lesser significance because they can't articulate it in the expected norms, because God transcends these bounds and instead seeks to continue to engage with everyone as a known and loved child of God. I believe the task of the Christian and the church is the pursuit of this relationship, and to encourage and facilitate those living with or without dementia to do the same, and to do this creatively and in a loving way, filled with grace, is of the utmost importance. And I hope that through listening to me talk this afternoon, you can see the imperative of engaging with an individual's spirituality in a deeper sense as we find them now, before their night is the noonday, giving them opportunities to engage with God, to commune with him, as each of us would seek to do in our own lives. And we have the privilege of being able to facilitate with others. Thank you so much for listening to me go on, and I hope I was clear. And if anybody has some questions they'd like to ask, please feel free to unmute and ask a question.